Hello, everyone, and welcome. We are excited that so many of you could join us today for our conversation on somatics and creative leadership. I'm Pele Shalev, the Events and Engagement Manager for the Office of Events at the California Institute of Integral Studies, a nonprofit university in San Francisco. We may be joining from different places all over the world, and as a representative of CIIS, I want to start off by expressing our debt and gratitude to the Ramaytush Ohlone, the original peoples and continual caretakers of the San Francisco Peninsula. CIIS campus is located on the traditional unceded lands of the Ramaytush Ohlone, which they call Yalamu. In the Ramaytush Ohlone language, Yalamu identifies both the people and the territory. This acknowledgement is only a single small step towards being in deeper connection and relationship with Indigenous tribes and organizations in our community, and does not begin to acknowledge all the native lands, languages, and territories where you are right now, or where you live and work every day. I invite you to take a moment now to acknowledge the land where you reside, and to commit to learn more about the native communities near you, and to support their work. If it feels right for you to share in the chat, please do. We always recommend native-land.ca as a good starting resource. Before we start, I want to go over a few general tips and troubleshooting items. We will have a Q&A after the conversation tonight. Please submit your questions at any time using our anonymous web form, which is linked in the event description below this video. We'll be pulling questions from that form, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. We do have automatically generated captions for this event, which you can toggle on and off using the closed captioning button in YouTube. Chat will be enabled during this event, but please note that it is not being moderated, and our presenters cannot see the chat. Chat is not required to fully experience the event. If you choose to participate in chat, please be respectful and avoid language that can be offensive or insensitive to others. You can turn the chat off at any time, and we encourage you to do so if you find it negatively impacting your experience in any way. If you're having issues with your audio or video, we always suggest that you start by refreshing the page, and then if you're still having issues, we suggest that you adjust your video settings within YouTube. I'd like to extend a special thanks to the members of Public Programs. Public Programs membership has never been more valuable, providing a year's worth of conversations for free and every workshop for 20% off. You can find more info on our website or email us at publicprograms@ciis.edu. Now, let me first introduce our presenters, Nick Walker and Alfonso Montuori, and then we'll get right to the conversation. Dr. Nick Walker is a professor of psychology and psychedelic studies here at CIIS, as well as a senior aikido teacher at the Aiki Arts Center Dojo in Berkeley. In addition to almost half a century of aikido experience, Dr. Walker has an extensive background in a variety of transformative somatic practices, from Tai Chi to bioenergetic therapy to Jungian-informed physical theater. Dr. Alfonso Montuori is an educator, consultant, and musician. Alfonso was born in the Netherlands, an Italian citizen, and grew up a third culture kid, living in Lebanon, Greece, and England. He studied at the University of London before moving to the US in his mid-20s for graduate school. In the mid-80s, he taught at the Central South University in Hunan, China, and then returned to the US permanently. He has been distinguished visiting professor in the Fine Arts Department of Miami University and in the Dynamic and Clinical Psychology Department of Sapienza University of Rome. Alfonso is the author of several books and numerous articles which have been translated into many languages. An active musician, he performs and records playing saxophones, flute, and electronic wind instruments. Alfonso collaborates with his wife, award-winning jazz singer Kitty Margolis, playing in her band and co-producing her recordings. And now it is my absolute pleasure to turn it over to Nick Walker and Alfonso Montuori.
Well, hi, Nick. What a
Hi,
pleasure
Alfonso.
to be here. And
Yeah.
clearly, I gave a little bit of a longer bio than you did because you've got plenty of stuff that could have gone in there. But here we go.
Here we go. Here we are. It's so great to, it's always great to get to have a conversation with you. We don't usually do it this publicly, but
Right,
here
right.
we are
No,
talking about somatics and creative leadership.
Exactly. Yeah. So we were just talking a little earlier and saying maybe it would be an idea for me to just give a little background on the whole idea of creative leadership as we engage with it here at CIIS, specifically in the transformative leadership master's program. And then after that, have you give a sense of what somatics is, and then we'll attempt to marry the two, right?
Yeah, let's do it.
Great. So, creative leadership or transformative leadership, as we refer to it in our program here at CIIS, is very much a leadership for a time of transition, for a time of transformation. I think everybody can see that the world is changing rapidly. There's chaos, there's confusion, there's a transition of a world that's trying to be born, and at the same time, there are movements towards going back to sort of idealized days before, right? And so the question then is, given all that confusion and the overwhelm and just the every time we turn on the news there's something new and usually unsettling, how to deal with that, right? And one factor there is this idea of creativity, because creativity is not just about creativity in the arts or sciences or developing new ideas and so on, but it's also very much a way of being in the world, that is able to respond to the challenges of the world, but also generate alternatives to what's going on based on our values, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, in that sense, transformative leadership is not something for which you have to be, a CEO or a president or any that kind of formal role at all. I think in this day and age, everybody in a way is a leader because they're contributing to the direction that we're going in, which is also why it's important to have a sense of what's at play, what are the possibilities, the directions that we can go in, right? And we always have to remember that not doing anything is also doing something.
Yes.
Right? To the extent that I don't vote, I'm also engaging, right, and showing up, right. So that all makes a difference. And creativity, just like leadership, was for the longest time about the great man, uh, so these historical figures, always men and always great. Um, with creativity, we had this idea of the lone genius, right? And that was sort of the dominant image of creativity. So now, though, we're seeing a much more complex picture of creativity as being distributed, relational, but
Right.
also having to do with self-creation, creating who we are, and very much with a neglected area, for instance, like interpersonal creativity, right?
Mm-hmm.
In this
Mm-hmm.
polarized world, we're seeing so much conflict. How can we become creative about the way that we interact with
Yeah.
others and create win-win interactions rather than based on, well, I win, you lose, zero-sum games, right? So creativity in that sense is much more, has a much broader reach and is much more relevant. I'll be the last one to say that the arts and the sciences are not relevant. My point here is that it's a much broader phenomenon that we're talking about here.
Right.
So that is then essentially sort of this overview of creative leadership and transformative leadership. Because of these times that we're in, we need to show up differently, more creatively, contribute, because we know from chaos theory, the idea of the butterfly effect, small small actions, small processes can make a huge difference. So we have to pay attention to what we do and say. All right.
Right.
And there's always a glimmer of hope there that actions will have a much more far-reaching effect.
Mm.
Right.
Hmm.
So yeah, so let's leave that there for a moment and move on to the topic of somatics, which you are very knowledgeable about and are a practitioner of, right?
Yes, that was a great explanation of creative leadership. I'm really excited by that. So,
Thank you very
um,
much.
all right. So, to explain somatics, I need to explain a closely related concept, which is embodiment. And embodiment is our embodiment is what we're doing on a physical level, what we're being, what we're doing on a physical bodily level. We're all embodied all the time because we are bodies. So one of the sort of symptoms of uh, old patriarchal hierarchical models of top-down, less creative leadership is this idea of separation of mind and body. The mind is
Yeah,
king and the body, is the lowly servant of the mind.
yeah,
But of course, if you look at how humans actually develop, we're not minds riding around in bodies the way people ride around in cars. We're bodies that think. And the human development process, right? We develop as bodies first in the womb, and our cognitive capacities develop out of the process of being infants and exploring the sensory world and learning our way around our own bodies and what our bodies can sense, right? This is what you know the child psychologist Piaget called the sensory motor stage of development, and our sort of the roots of how we think come from that bodily sensory motor stage, and we build on it from there. So we are always embodied by definition because we're always being bodies. And the our psyches and our cognitive capacities, including our creative capacities, in a sense, are enacted through the body. They're happening, in the brain and connections, these webs of neural connection, and uh, everything we know and the way we think is encoded in the brain and webs of neural connection. The brain is part of the body and it's not separable from the rest of the body, right? It shares
right,
blood and
right.
other fluids and oxygen with the body, and it's wired into the body with miles and miles of nerve cells. So we're these living body minds, and we uh we move the body and embody ourselves in the world, move around and experience the world through our bodies on a sensory level and perform actions. And this builds new neural pathways, right? We move our eyes to read, and we listen with our ears, and all of this is building new neural pathways. And so in a sense, our whole psyche, our whole self, and our capacities, our cognitive capacities, our psychological capacities, including those creative capacities, have their roots in how we use the body, or how we use ourselves as bodies. Our late wonderful mutual friend, Dr. Ian Grand from the Somatics program, uh, was a wonderful teacher, we in the somatics program at CIIS for many, many years, until he passed in 2017. And so when I went through that program, he was one of my teachers. And I remember the first day of class with him, the first time I had a class, he asked if we could give some basic premise for upon which somatic psychology was built. And I thought I was very clever and first went with my hand up. And I said, the organization of the psyche mirrors the organization of the body. And he said in his big booming voice, no, the organization of the psyche is the organization of the body. So, so that's embodiment. And so how I would define somatics based on that is somatics is the practice of changing the self by making intentional changes to one's embodiment.
Wow. That's so, as you were talking, so many things. I want to come back to that particular process
Yes, absolutely.
and sort of the practices related to that, right?
Mm-hmm.
But as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, this whole academia in general, historically and to this day, in many cases, is really about disembodied and dispassionate inquirers, right?
Right.
You don't have a body, right? And you don't have feelings. Or, well, you do, but we're supposed to sweep them all under the carpet, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the same in the way that people talk about economics, these concepts like rational economic man, right? That's a concept that you almost think was invented by somebody who had never looked at what people actually do. But rational economic man, and again, these ideas that people are just sort of these calculating machines, calculating their own self-interest and so on. But the body and feelings
Mm-hmm.
are not part of it, right? So that's a tremendous absence
Right.
that has been. Well, I think now we're beginning to realize that we can go on this way. Academics are not dispassionate. When honesty researchers get busted for being dishonest about how they work with their data, you start thinking, well, maybe researchers have feelings too, and egos, and so it's time to reintegrate all that. So talk to me about transformation then, really, which is what you're talking about there, right?
Yeah, let's talk about that. So yeah, so somatics is sort of by definition a practice of making change. We talk about somatic work or somatic practice. It's a practice or work designed to create some sort of transformation. And so we have we are very we are feeling beings. We're not rational. And a lot of modern Western somatic psychology traces back to Wilhelm Reich, who was a crackpot in many ways, but very right about one particular thing. So Reich was a student of Freud's, and Freud, of course, was very big on this idea that humans are not rational, that we're driven by a lot of unconscious factors, a lot of factors that we're not really conscious of, and we think that we're rational, but
Right.
we're actually, what we are is very good at rationalizing our behavior, which comes from from very irrational things, from habits we've developed and defensive habits we've developed that we haven't really questioned.
Right, right.
And we really see this, I think this comes up very strongly in transformative leadership, where the biggest obstacle, one of the biggest obstacles to truly creative leadership often is when people are scared of uncertainty and scared of the loss of
Yeah,
control.
yeah.
And it requires some embrace of uncertainty in order to be creative, because if the immediate response to any uncertainty is fear, then it's just like try to clamp down and get control as soon as
Right,
possible.
right.
So we need to transcend that impulse in order to start opening up the creativity.
Yeah,
So so Freud was recognizing that people had these impulses to control or to repress and hide certain things from themselves and others, various sorts of guilt and shame and raw need. And then we're, appearing to be rational, and because they became very good at rationalizing and justifying their actions. Um, but of course, if you look at, the supposed rational economic man, like a lot of people's economic behavior is based on this terrible gnawing sense of scarcity and need, which is not
right,
rational.
right.
So Wilhelm Reich's stroke of genius was recognizing this uh, inseparability of the mind and body, and saying, okay, well, Freud says people are not rational, and they have all of these psychological defense mechanisms and needs and sort of habits of attempting to control things and meet unmet developmental needs and such. They pass that off as rational behavior. But where do all of these habits live on a bodily level?
Mm, mm, mm.
So Reich had this whole idea around character structure and chronic people's chronic tensions that he referred to as character armor.
Mm.
And this idea that, if a person, uh, for instance, you look at like the very classic sort of macho patriarchal control-oriented, dominance-oriented leader figure.
Yeah.
And um, what you see is a limited emotional range, where often,
Mm.
they were raised in patriarchal cultures where they learned, boys don't cry, men don't express tenderness and such,
Right, right,
right?
right.
So here's the thing is, well, how do you not cry? How do you not feel tenderness? To do that, if you watch a child try not to cry or try not to be tender or vulnerable because it's not a safe situation to do that, the child has to tense itself in particular ways. And you can watch like a toddler trying not to cry will tense its face in particular ways and tense its breathing in particular ways to stop that from happening. And so Reich's thesis was that sort of habit of clamping down physically to stop a feeling becomes a lifelong unconscious habit.
Mm, mm,
And
mhm, mhm.
people's whole bodily structures and bodily organizations get formed around these habits, which they're largely unconscious of. And so when you look at someone whose creativity as a leader, say, is restricted because all they want to do is clamp down and control or acquire more and more or something,
Right.
somewhere that's happening in the body. Those limitations are manifesting as limitations in breathing, as limitations in how the body can move because of deep muscular tensions that are permanently clamped down. And the person just thinks that's the way it is. That's what it feels like to be in a body, and isn't really aware of all the capacities there, and isn't really aware of all their emotional capacities that are connected to that. And so so then the process of recovering the ability to feel and recovering the ability to, say, be present with uncertainty or with tenderness or with empathy becomes a process of releasing those bodily tensions, of changing the bodily habits that are connected to the emotional and cognitive habits. And it's uh, practices that can do that are fairly intense often. And Reich was notorious for very intense practices. It was just about breaking down the deep layers of armoring and not really thinking very much about how do you integrate all of that well. But the subsequent developments there in somatic psychology are more a little more refined. And of course,
I'm assuming Rolfing was a spin-off
Rolfing had
in
was
some ways, maybe.
in some way it was connected. It came out of the same time period, so there was a mutual influence, but not really direct. But
Not,
yeah,
yeah,
there were
okay.
definitely similarities. And the Rolfers weren't paying a lot of attention to the emotional effects. They were aware that there was an emotional effect happening with the releases, but they
Yeah,
weren't necessarily aiming for psychological transformation as much, but it certainly
right, right.
happened.
Yeah,
And of course, the Rolfers, like Reich, had their own flaws in terms of, Reich had these ideas about, what the ideal healthy person would be like. That was a particularly, gender binary,
right.
heteronormative, westernized idea of what, where he thought if you could break down all the character armor, he had this very specific idea of what would the result be. And the Rolfers similarly were very like,
Yeah,
this is what the perfect posture always looks like. So
right, right.
uh, so the move in somatic psychology, and we've seen a lot of that work at CIIS, sort of the move in somatic psychology is in recent decades has been much more explore explore and develop your capacities, explore and
Mm,
find
mm,
out, rather than aiming for some platonic ideal.
right. Of the
Yes.
perfect human. Yeah,
Right, exactly, which has its own, patriarchal, hierarchical
right.
slant to it. So instead there's just this, what capacities do you want to be able to access and develop? And what are
Right.
the practices that will allow you to do it?
Yeah,
Becomes
yeah,
very relevant to transformative
yeah.
leadership.
Definitely. And I mean, I think one of the things that we're seeing so much of in the last few years, not that historically it's also shown up all the time, but these leaders with feet of clay, right? And of course, if you look at gurus historically, there are any number of gurus exhibiting extremely problematic behavior, but of course with leaders as well, right? And interestingly, a lot of it seems to also be related to sort of forms of sexual domination and abuse, right?
Right.
So I'm wondering, at a certain point, you were saying these people have a certain sense of being in the body, whether that then doesn't translate to how they see the whole world in a way, right? That they see the whole world through this lens of their own sort of mixed up embodiment, if you will, right?
Yeah, exactly. Their own need, their own hunger,
right.
right? So there's and I think that Carl Jung didn't talk about the somatic in a very direct way. He's not seen as a somatic psychologist, but of course
Right.
Jung's
Right.
work on the shadow is
Yeah.
really essential, and it meshes with the somatic so well, right? Jung's idea was, people have this public, public persona, the person they want to be and want to be known as. And the shadow side of that, or such flip side of that, the shadow side, right? The persona is the part they bring into the light, but there's always the shadow flip side of the parts of themselves that they reject and keep repressed and keep hidden from themselves as much as from
Right,
anyone else, right?
right,
That
right.
that's the stuff that doesn't fit with the self-image and the public image they want to cultivate.
Yeah, yeah,
And so Jung talked about how, becoming whole requires owning the shadow, or it leaks out.
yeah.
We project it onto some imagined enemy. We
Right.
project it onto an enemy, and you get people, with all the isms, the racism and
Yeah,
nationalism and the
yeah, yeah.
homophobia and stuff, where anything we reject in ourselves, we end up seeing and hating in some other that we can imagine has this quality we can't face in ourselves. But also it leaks out in terms of, the leader who's always presenting themselves as virtuous and admirable. Like, what about their lust and their hunger and all that ends up coming out in twisted ways
Right, right,
because they're not owning it, because they're
right.
hiding it, and it kind of festers until it comes out in some way that ends up victimizing others and undermining their teachings. So shadow work, the process of owning and integrating the shadow so it doesn't fester and leak out in toxic ways, can also be done somatically. In fact, it's hard to do it in a non-somatic way
Mm-hmm.
because, and that if you that act of becoming more aware of what's happening on a bodily level is an act of and changing it is an act of shadow work. The act of, like, okay, if we're repressing some aspect of ourselves, the act of learning to not repress it and to own it and embrace it involves some physical opening to it and allowing ourselves to embody it in an intentional way so we don't embody it in an unconscious and destructive way.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, this is uh, very important stuff because I think it's really clear at this point that leadership of any kind requires a great deal of self-reflection. And it doesn't even have to be, again, leadership of people in
Hmm.
positions of power, although there, of course, it would be particularly helpful, perhaps. But
Yes,
but
yes.
I think we are at a point kind of in human evolution where it's become more and more important to sort of take responsibility for our own psyche, if you will,
Yes,
right?
yes.
And that in order to have a society where we don't demonize others, we don't get so polarized the way we are now, we can have a better sense of how much we are contributing to the conflict rather than, saying, well, they're the bad guys, like we're good and
Yes.
they are bad, right? These
Hmm.
classic uh, tropes. So it seems like it's certainly when in our transformative leadership program, this sort of self inquiry becomes a big part of that.
Hmm.
And it can be obviously a little difficult, tricky, but it's important work because we can see, particularly if people do then develop certain degrees of power and responsibility, it really accentuates our problems, our shadow even more, right? When we have that sense that develops of sort of omnipotence, even if it's only in our little world, our little fiefdom, our little, right? You see this in the most well-meaning non-profits,
Yes.
devoted to the environment or whatever, with good causes, but you see them fall apart very often because these problems emerge, and not just with the leader, but in the way that people interact.
Right.
And as you said, this enormous amount of projection that can start happening. So I think this is one of the key elements right now, because
Yes.
we're seeing too much in the news about the flaws of leaders of all sorts, right?
Right. And it's so much of it in terms of everything from, people, political leaders getting into wars or nonprofits falling apart, people, groups of people trying to cooperate, but being torn apart by conflict, to like, you know, the abusive behavior of some teachers or domestic
Right,
violence. All of this, so
right,
much of this is people's inability to do conflict well.
right,
All right. The ability to navigate, because people are different from each other. And so the ability to navigate differences and to navigate potential conflicts is an absolutely essential leadership skill. Without
yeah,
it, a
yeah,
person is only a good leader until they run into some sort of difference or, conflict or, a difference of viewpoint. And then suddenly it all erupts into terrible flame wars and rage and
right,
attempt to clamp down and assert control and dominance.
exactly, yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, this is why Aikido has kept me engaged
Mm,
for almost
tell me,
half a
yeah, yeah.
century now, right? This is why I love Aikido in particular as a form of somatic work. There's so many great forms of somatic work, and they all have different purposes. But
Hmm,
uh,
hmm.
uh, Aikido has particularly fascinated me and proven to be endlessly transformative and rewarding. Um, because it is somatic work done specifically around conflict and how we embody ourselves in situations of conflict.
Mm,
And
hmm.
so
Right, right, right.
this is the uh so here's the thing with Aikido is it's a very interesting, very strange sort of martial art because it's not two people sparring with each other. It's one person giving an attack, and you work with a partner and you trade off, attacking each
Mhm.
other. But it's one person like, giving an attack, grabbing or striking or something like that. And the other person is uh finding a way to redirect the attack and uh, connect the attacker to themselves and guide the attacker, into a fall or into a pin or just away from them. So there's this like, okay, this person is suddenly, grabbing me by the shoulders, grabbing me by the lapels, and with a lot of fury and power. And how how do I move in a way, and maybe this person is really big and strong, and how do I move in a way that does not kill or maim this person, but takes them off balance so that I can take them to the ground without hurting either of us? And the answer to how to do that is you have to be very relaxed
Mm, hmm, hmm.
because um you have to feel everything that's happening in your own body, and you have to feel everything that's happening in your partner's body. You have an attacker, and the only way you're going to be able to take a bigger, stronger attacker to the ground effectively when they don't want to go necessarily is if you can feel where the openings in their balance are, and where they're strong and where there's openings. Now, to feel that, you have to be very soft, because if you tense up, all you feel are the tensions in your own body.
Mm-hmm.
So your own body has to be soft enough that it becomes a sensitive instrument of feeling. But if you're being attacked, it's really hard to do that, because the fight, flight, freeze reflex comes
Right?
up and
Yeah.
all of the bodily tensions arise. And so you have to be super aware of your own body to notice any tension that's arising and actively release it while you are being attacked and feeling what's going on in the attacker's body, so you can direct it the way you want it to go.
Yeah.
It's enormously crazy complex to do all of that, which is why it's like a long-term, it's a really long-term practice, because it's just endlessly challenging. So
Counterintuitive, right? I mean,
super counterintuitive, and literally, like it goes, you're learning to transform, because you're overriding the fight flight instinct, which is like, I mean, that's like deep lizard brain stuff, to learn to override that and change that, so you learn to flow and feel instead of the fight or flight. Like, that's an ongoing practice that you never get good at. You get less and less bad at it. And so yeah, I love this. Now here's the magic of it, though. Here's where the real, like, somatic magic comes in, is that um our range. So creativity is, by definition, uh expansive, unlimited, right? There's so much outside the box we can find. But dysfunction and the tensions that block creativity are actually a very limited set of patterns. So each person actually, in terms of like deep tensions and tendency toward, like, the physical states we go into when we're not doing well and when we're not handling things well, there's actually a very limited range that each person has. So the thing is, the physical reactions that a person has, the way particular bodily tensions show up, and particular tendencies to clamp down or force things, the physical reactions a person has when they're being grabbed in aikido practice, for instance, are actually just more exaggerated versions of the same physical reactions that people have in verbal conflicts and everyday stress situations, which means if you can learn to spot those patterns of tension arising in yourself, in aikido practice when someone's grabbing you, from there you can learn to spot them when you're in any sort of difficult situation and release them in those situations too.
Yeah. Oh, that's terrific. Yeah. 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 So there's that wonderful crossover there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Nick, we have about 10 minutes left, and I was thinking maybe we could talk a little bit about something that we both are interested in and care about, and that's this idea of the creative futures, right?
Yes.
Because in that sense, transformative leadership, creative leadership is about leading into the future, how we show up, and the creative futures really is there to address the fact that so many people have lost any sense of hope for the future.
Right. And of course, if you're going to be a transformative leader, right, there's the question of what are you leading toward, right? What are you creating? We have to be able
exactly.
We have to have some concept of the future we want in order to have something to go toward.
Precisely, yeah, because there's so much focus on the things that we don't want, whether it's racism or sexism or woke or whatever. Everybody's against lots of things, but we seem to have lost track of what we do want and what we would
Hmm.
like to see more of, right? So the idea of creative futures is sort of to develop some of the basic sort of core competencies to be able to participate in a way that is more generative, that is moving in a
Yes.
direction that develops a sense of agency and a sense of hope, right?
Yes.
Because that's what people need, I think. Otherwise, a lot of people are just sort of giving up on the future, right?
Right.
So I mean, the things that you were talking about in terms of somatics, I think, play a huge role in preparing people to participate as transformative leaders, if you will, as individuals who are contributing to a future that they perceive as better or more desirable than all these futures that we don't want. You know?
Yes.
So and that's where creativity comes in too, and again, not just in creating visions of different futures, but also how do we interact. You know, you were talking about the aikido and its importance in how we interact, and so it seems to me that somatics and creativity there could create kind of a nice team in the way that we engage with others, uh, remaining aware of who we are, and at the same time being able to embody the improvisational ability to deal with responses that may be unexpected or undesirable, and shift towards more of a generative interaction, right?
Yes, exactly. Right. Because say, okay, just say here we are, we decide we have a group of people. We get a group of people together, and they're influential in various fields, or they're representing various groups and communities who have a stake in, the future of whatever, whether it's the future of the country, the future of CIIS, or
Right.
whatever it is. We get a group of people together and we start coming up with a common vision of the future. What do we all want? What do we want to be working toward? And someone in the group has an idea that hadn't occurred to me and is like seems just totally incompatible with what I was thinking. Now, if my reaction to that is I have to shut this down. I have to,
Hmm.
no, this is
Right.
unacceptable. I have to shut this down. We're not going to get anywhere, right? Then they're going to be like, oh, this person's trying to shut me down. I'm not going to let that happen. And suddenly
Right.
everybody's fighting and arguing. And there goes, the chance to create something better. Instead, it's just the same old people polarizing and fighting with each other.
Yeah.
So what if someone, comes up with something, says something that's totally, whoa, what? What if I have that somatic practice under my belt and I can say, I can feel what's happening in my body and say, oh, I'm clamping down, right? There's that thing I do where like my breathing gets shallower, I start making myself bigger maybe, or I tense, like, that the eyes tense, the hands tense, legs get ready for fight flight. I feel all of this. Oh, I know from my somatic practice of aikido or whatever it is I do how to let go. I'm going to take a breath and let this go. And once I've let that go on a bodily level, suddenly there's room for something else. Suddenly there's
Right.
space on a bodily level for me to listen and say something that is more constructive, that builds on this. And we can still
Yeah.
disagree. I can still say,
Right.
I'm not sure that's going to work. I'm having trouble seeing how that will be compatible. Can we talk about how we can make our goals compatible? But then we're having a creative conversation instead of fighting about it because
Right.
the bodies are doing different things.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it reminds me of Keats's term, the poet Keats, a negative capability. So, which is in a way is
Yes.
this ability to stay with the chaos, with the uncertainty,
Hmm.
rather than try to shut it down immediately, because all that uncertainty or disagreement makes us feel uncomfortable, right? We want to go
Right.
back to where we were before, but to be able to stay with that. And I think that what the somatics dimension does is it's so important is it gives people actual practices to
Yes.
be able to do that. And so it's not just sort of a cognitive exercise or a reminder or some, attempt at a psychological process. And I think that has become, in the psychology literature, we talk about tolerance of ambiguity, right?
Yes.
Which is directly related to creativity in the same way that intolerance of ambiguity is related to authoritarianism.
Yeah.
Authoritarian individuals score high on intolerance of ambiguity. So the ability
Exactly.
to stay with that ambiguity is so important in a world. My friend, the British Pakistani futurist Zia Sardar calls post-normal times.
Right.
When he
Right.
first came up with that concept, people went, "Oh, well, I don't know." Right now, look around and everything is pretty post-normal, right? But
Yeah.
that causes so much anxiety too. And so that also causes people to look for somebody who will shut the whole thing down and make it
Right.
go away, make that uncertainty go away, even if it means doing so harshly, right?
Hmm.
Rather than staying with things, because we're not quite prepared yet to be dealing with the change and
Hmm.
letting things emerge and creating trust among each
Right.
other, right? Because that's another role of creativity, right? To create trust between people, because now there's such a huge degree of mistrust, right? Everybody
Right.
mistrusts everybody else, right?
Right. And that's another form of intolerance for ambiguity and intolerance for
Exactly.
uncertainty, right? Oh, I
Yeah.
don't I don't know this person, so I don't trust them. I'm
Right.
not willing to let them in. I'm not willing to trust them. I'm not willing to listen to them because I don't know them. But of course, that becomes a cycle where, well, if you're not
Right.
willing to give it a chance, then you never get to trust them. And so it becomes only people only trusting other people within some immediate in-group of who that agrees with them completely.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So the that tolerance for uncertainty and ambiguity is
Yeah.
crucial. And it's crucial for creativity because by
Yeah.
definition, with creativity, you're creating something new and you don't know
Yeah.
exactly what it's going to be during the creative process.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
you're exploring, it's otherwise if you're just duplicating what already exists, right? Which of
Yeah.
course is what,
Exactly.
which is the appeal of authoritarianism to people
Right.
is that
The conformity. Yeah.
they're terrified of the unknown and the uncertain, and they'd rather have some authoritarian who's going to like be there. Oh, I'm going to make America great again, right? I'm going to put everything back the way you remember it from 1950s television shows.
From Father Knows Best.
Right,
Right.
exactly. So you won't have to wonder what's happening because
Right.
everything is going to be exactly the way that you imagined it as a child. So the yeah, this to get anywhere new, to create anything new, and to let other ideas in to deal with, to be open to the innovations that come with diversity and difference and synergy between different people and cultures and ideas, right? We need that tolerance for ambiguity and the radical piece that somatic practices offer is the idea that tolerance for ambiguity is a teachable physical skill.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And in fact, I have a doctoral student who's doing a dissertation on just that right now. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah. And another thing that I think is important here in this context is improvisation,
Yes.
right? Improvisation is not something that we're aware of being taught in school or in any. It's just sort of lives in the arts rather mysteriously, but improvisation is so important because it really the root of the word improvisation is improvisus, which means unforeseen, right? So
Mhm.
improvisation is all about dealing with the unforeseen, that which wasn't planned for, wasn't expected. And this is, of course, something musicians, certainly jazz musicians and other improvisational musicians, learn how to do, but it's still very much of a mystery to most people who don't realize that they actually improvise whenever they talk to somebody, right?
Right.
I mean, there it may not be a world-class improvisation, but it's still an improvisation, right? So there's this is heartening to me, is that there are so many resources and so many things that we can bring to bear to creating futures that are more desirable, that are not heading in the way of self-destruction, if
Yes.
I can be blunt.
Yes, exactly. And
Um,
improvisation also, right? There's a physical opening up to it to allow it, right?
yeah,
Where's that the tendency to clamp down, the
yeah,
physical tendency to clamp down and not allow the unfamiliar and not allow the unfamiliar movements or the unfamiliar gestures, the unfamiliar ways of being.
right.
And so there's this bodily aspect to improvisation of how do I let myself on a bodily level move into something new and become
Right.
something new.
And that reminds me of something that you were talking about earlier, sort of about uh, 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 the about the body and being. In a way, what we're talking about here is trusting ourselves,
Yeah,
trusting that we don't need a script in order to work out exactly what's going on, right?
right.
And that we can be in the moment, and for the jazz musicians, perform in the moment, and let go of all the music and even let go of the training that they've had and just play, right?
Yeah.
So, and one last thing, I think that there's been research on expertise by the Dreyfus brothers, UC, and they found a number of levels of expertise, right? From take it from beginner driver, somebody that's still trying to figure out how to move everything around in the car, to people who just racing car drivers. And what they found about the experts in all of the places that they explored them is that they knew how to improvise.
Yeah.
They made no reference to any handbooks or manuals, or they were just there in the moment. Even those people who play chess and can just walk by 10 chess boards and um, so all of that is an improvisational ability that shows up in so many different places, right? So in the
Yeah.
ability to deal with the unforeseen.
Yes, exactly.
Mm-mm.
And there's a bodily component to all of that of uh of allowing something to flow through you, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's
Yeah.
here I am, uh uh essentially flowing with the unforeseen, right? As flowing with the emerging situation.
Mhm.
So
Yes.
so I
Yes.
have to be able to physically flow with the emerging situation. I have to allow responses to move through me, right? And
Mm-hmm.
as soon as I lock down and go into some old physical pattern of self-protectiveness, I'm unable to respond spontaneously to the situation. And so so it becomes the release of tension becomes not just how do I stay out of old habits of defensiveness and fight flight and such like that, but also how do I make room for something new to flow through me? How do I make
Yes,
room for a
exactly.
completely spontaneous response to occur?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's beautifully put. Yeah, because that obviously is what it is in music too, right?
Yeah,
It's that
yeah,
something new is coming through, but we don't know what, right? And so we have to trust ourselves. Nick, is it time
yeah.
to
I
answer some
think
questions?
I think it's time to look at the Q&A. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's look at this first question. I'll read this one aloud. This one looks like it's addressed to you, so I'll read it
Mm.
off the question here. All right. Alfonso says that everyone is a creative leader. However, only a few leaders hold political and social power. So, how do we transform creative leadership into creative power within the hierarchical patriarchy in which we live?
That's a good question. I think I have to clarify that everybody can be a creative leader and that it requires what they would call a conscientization, so a becoming aware of what we are doing in the moment anyway, right? Because I don't think we are aware or in many cases responsible for our actions and what it is that we do in everyday life, right? So I think the um, the issue is one of becoming aware that no matter where we are, we have an impact on other people's lives, right? We may not be the president of the United States, but our actions have a direct impact on people around us, right? And that's, for me, no matter who we are, the place to begin, right? And my sense is that the more people become aware of that and the more begin to orient towards a different kind of vision, that in and of itself makes a difference. That we start with the bottom, rather than go for the top. Of course, it's helpful if people at the top are that way too. But I think becoming aware of our innate creativity and how it shows up in daily life is the first place to start. And daily life is our everyday experience is the first place to start. Um,
And I would add also that, in terms of people holding political and social power, uh, only a few leaders hold political and social power on, large, national scales or statewide scales or something. But anyone can within a specific situation, right? Within a specific like friend group or
mhm.
classroom or school or right, what scale are we talking? Because
Right.
uh it's important to recognize the power one does have within smaller groups. And
Absolutely. Yeah.
larger groups are made of smaller groups, right? If you
Yeah.
have ultimately a large scale change for the better is going to involve a lot of solidarity between different
Yeah.
groups, right? Uh, we have a very divided populace here, and that serves the needs, that serves the ends of authoritarians, it serves the ends of the people who hold the political and financial power right now, is the vast level of power inequality where most people hold very little power on a large scale and are divided. And so the building of solidarity starts on a really small grassroots level,
It
right?
does.
Which means the
Yeah.
ability to be a calming presence in a room full of people, the ability to be the person in a room full of people who can stay calm and keep other people calm and start working out a common vision without it erupting into fighting. That is a high level of power. And if enough people do that, you start to build coalition and solidarity. And any large scale change is going to have to start there.
I completely agree. And I also I'm concerned by these kind of views that see those in power as being sort of all powerful, and then that makes the rest of us powerless. But we're not. And I think that's one of the main points that we're trying to make here. We're not. And we need to become aware of that and embody that awareness with creativity and an ability to actually bring forth what it is that we want. And that begins, I believe, in our everyday behavior. Of course, ripples move out. Of course, we can lead organizations, but it begins here, because what we see with the so-called great leaders is that it's precisely in their personal lives that some of them are the worst, if you will.
Right.
So, yeah. Here, there's a question that I think is good for you. How do you invite someone into the somatic practice who is resistant, disembodied, perhaps traumatized, to begin this kind of transformation?
Great question. All right. First of all, I want to speak to the structure, to the question itself. Uh, no one is disembodied because we are bodies. And so I'm gonna suggest a shift of the language from disembodied to dissociated. Dissociated meaning um, not responding to what is happening in the present moment, not feeling what is happening in the body right now. And that's a common trauma response, right? To be checked out. So one is responding to one's trauma and to old situations that were traumatic for one, or to one's fears, rather than responding to what's happening right now. And so you could say that the dissociation is the opposite of being present. So I know that some people use the term disembodied to mean that sort of thing, but I don't like it, because I think it's important to recognize that we are bodies and we're always embodying something. So a person who is dissociated and not aware of what's happening to them in the present on a bodily level is not disembodied. They're still a body. They're embodying dissociation. And the reason that becomes that I think that's a more constructive way to look at it is because then we can ask, if we start from everyone is embodied by virtue of being a body, then we can say, well, what is this person embodying right now? Oh, they're embodying their dissociation, they're embodying their trauma response. And then we can say, what would we like to be able to embody instead? What do we want? What do I want to be able to embody instead? What do I want to help this person embody instead? And so that's where I'd shift the language around that. So yes, dissociated, traumatized, in a reactive, resistant state where it's the goal of much somatic work is to change that. And how do you invite someone to begin the kind of transformation? Very gently. And it has to be voluntary, which is, I mean, why would we want to force someone to do that sort of work anyway? But also we can't, right? Because the somatic work has to be done from the inside, and it can be guided from the outside, but ultimately each person has to take responsibility for doing it themselves, because the deep muscle tensions in your body, you can only release them if you if you make a decision to start this practice of feeling them and letting them go, the reactivity that comes up for you is happening from the inside out. It's happening in the body.
Mhm.
You're the one with control over it. You're the one with control over your breath. You're the one who, most of all, each person controls their own attention. Most people don't know how to control their own attention very well, especially, in a society where there's a constant competition for attention, and where, uh, consumerist culture really is invested in keeping us from controlling our own attention. But ultimately, we can choose what to do with our attention and get better at using our attention in an intentional way, including paying attention to our bodily states. All of this has to happen from the inside. And um, so the answer is, how do you invite someone? It is an invitation. I can tell someone this work will help. I can tell someone, if you're miserable and suffering and find yourself always in conflict and feel powerless and terrified all the time, and are deeply uncomfortable being you, and beset by trauma, I can say, here is some work that can help. And I can say, come to my Aikido class, and we will, as long as you're willing to keep showing up, we can help you do this work. But it is up to each individual to do the work. It's something no one can do for them. And even in the world of somatic practice, including the world of Aikido and every other somatic practice I've ever seen, there are people who do the practice for years and years and years and do not change in any really meaningful way, because even though they're willing to go through the motions of the practice, they're not consistently willing to notice what's happening and take responsibility for changing it from the inside out, right? So ultimately, all any somatic practice can do, in a sense, is provide a structure and an opportunity to develop this self-awareness and start to find things to release and shift and open up. So yeah, that's the answer. It really is, the answer to how do you invite someone is, it really is an invitation, and it's an invitation that can be repeated, and it's an invitation that we can make gently and in a friendly, inviting way, and we can hold space for it. But all we can do is make the invitation and make the space and hope that people want to do that work.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, let's see.
Okay.
Is there anything behind the idea of a creative follower? Can we learn about teamwork by learning about leadership?
That's an interesting question.
It is.
I think if we look at musical examples, if we look at the way that group of musicians in jazz is organized, um, the whole band, it really is made up of creative followers, if you will. There will be a leader, perhaps, but the relationship is very different, in the sense that the leader creates a context, but the musicians themselves, and the word follower is not, I think, useful here, because it suggests some kind of a hierarchical relationship, or a relationship that's excessively hierarchical. So because the individuals contribute so much to the overall sound of the group, because the group depends on the relationships between the musicians. And I mean, I think this is also sort of moving into the how can the expressive arts aid in the integration of the shadow self question. I think from the arts we can learn a lot, and that also can break down some of these categories that I think at a certain point are not useful anymore, because there's also the concept of heterarchy, where rather than hierarchy, where people the person in a particular group that is most knowledgeable or most appropriate for addressing this or that particular situation will take, if you will, a leadership role for a while, but is not the always and forever leader. So I think there are possibilities to create much more fluid relationships that are based on something other than just organizational hierarchies. So in one sense, definitely creative followers, because everybody in a group can make a creative contribution. But I think if there's anything that we can learn about teamwork by learning about leadership is, well, consider yourself a leader too, not in the sense of egos and who's the leader, I'm the leader, but in the sense of taking responsibility. Right. I think that's the important thing at that point, because what we're we have to be responsible for what we're creating. And I think the relationship between creativity and responsibility is an important one that is often overlooked. Right. We have to be
Mm.
responsible for what we create at every moment, you know. So
And it's the same with the right, the somatic work too, right? That's like I was talking about the previous question. We are responsible. There's this process of taking responsibility for our own embodiment, right?
yeah.
If I'm, you know, if I'm too tense to engage constructively, I'm the one who's responsible for changing that. And so there's a self-responsibility there. Um, I do want to say around the idea of being a creative follower that one can lead by following in many
Yeah.
situations.
Yeah.
An example that comes to mind is when I'm in an Aikido class and I'm not the teacher, in my Aikido dojo, I'm the most senior teacher, but there are other advanced practitioners who also teach classes, and I get to go and be a student too, at least once a week, sometimes more. Um, and when I'm in the student mode, I'm paying attention and following the teacher's instruction in a way that sets an example for newer students, and or even in an academic classroom, right? I come into an academic classroom and uh, I'm older than a lot of college students, and I have a certain presence to me from years and years of Aikido practice and such. And if I come into the classroom and the teacher starts talking and I bust out my phone and start texting, I'm setting a terrible example here. But if I'm paying close attention to the teacher and responding to what the teacher's lesson, I'm modeling something that will pull other people in as well. And so this act of being a good follower of how the class is being led
Hmm.
makes me a leader, and that I'm showing other people something about how they can constructively engage.
That's a perfect example. That's a perfect example. Yeah, and that's why sort of the follower leader, the clear binary there breaks down, right? And I just wanted, before we move on to these two questions, I wanted to add one thing is that people very often will ask, how can I be creative? How can I be more creative? And I would say we are being creative all the time. So the question is not how can I be creative? The question is what am I creating? And is this actually what I want to be creating? Because all our interactions, all our behaviors, all our words, everything is it's we are creating them in the moment. So is that what we want to create? Rather than say, well, am I creating? We are. Is it any good?
Right.
Um,
Okay, I've got one addressed to me
yes.
here. Nick, you mentioned Aikido as a somatic practice that helped you to navigate a conflict that came up in your life. Indeed, many, many conflicts that have come up in my life. Can you talk through an example of how this process can help folks without therapeutic experience? Can people who have access to other embodied practices like sports or exercise use them to navigate conflict? Um, so uh, you don't need therapeutic experience in this case, right? As far as uh a somatic practice like Aikido helping you to navigate conflict in your life, helping you to navigate your life more gracefully in general. Um, the practice teaches that if you engage in the practice diligently over a long period of time, and if you are committed to consistent self-reflection and self-awareness, even when it's hard, and if you are committed to bringing the mindfulness of the practice into the rest of your life, that's what you need. That's what makes it happen. You don't need
Mm,
therapeutic experience, right?
mhm.
Uh when I was in the somatic psychology program, I was required as a student to do 50 hours of therapy with a somatic therapist. I'm not a good candidate for therapy. I'm too self-driven. I like teachers. I don't particularly find therapy useful to me. Uh, I got nothing out of the 50 hours of therapy except the lesson that I was better off with practices like Aikido than being in therapy. And those 50 hours are the only time in my life I've been in therapy. So yeah, I don't think you need experience of being in therapy. And certainly Aikido was helpful to me long before I got my therapist training, so yeah, I don't think you need the therapeutic experience. I think um self-reflection and diligent practice of well-chosen somatic practices is what is needed. It has its own therapeutic effect. And if you happen to be the sort of person who benefits from therapy and you have a good therapist, that can also be beneficial, of course, and you can combine those things in various ways. Can people who have access to other embodied practices like sports or exercise use them to navigate conflict? Yes, but remember, um, this is about our capacity to creatively navigate conflict or anything else, to creatively navigate any difficult situation, um, is tied into our bodily capacities, what we're able to embody. So, um, the thing I like about Aikido, and there are other practices that can do this as well, for sure, is that it's specifically focused on, well, how do you open up and stay creative and flow spontaneously with the situation in a stress or conflict situation? There's not a lot of sports that specifically teach that, or other forms of exercise that specifically teach it. But if you are conscious of that, if you're aware of the potentials and the dynamics, if you have this idea that, oh, I'm going to learn to release my deep tensions and be open, more open to uncertainty and more open to other people and to connection, and allow this spontaneous responsiveness to flow through me and still my fight flight reflex, well, maybe you can use any physical activity as a way of working with it. So some activities are more designed for that than others, right? And there's activities that aren't as directly conflict oriented, but like practices like authentic movement, for instance, spontaneous practices of spontaneous movement where you're feeling the body deeply can certainly enable this well. If you're a football player, and you're looking for like, how can I turn football into a practice that transforms my ability to deal with conflict in a more loving, graceful manner? That's gonna take the sport is not designed for that. So it's going to take some work. I could see you doing it. Like, oh wow, here's a bunch of people running at me and tackling me, and I'm gonna practice feeling relaxed and feeling love and empathy for them, even while I try to get away from them. Like, yeah, you could work on that. It's more of a challenge when the practice you're doing is not designed for that sort of work, but I don't see why it wouldn't be possible.
Right.
Are there other practices that can complement somatics to help one affect transformative change that you recommend and or practice yourselves? Well, Alfonso has talked about his music practice already, right? The jazz practice
Sure. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting because if you pay attention also to your playing and what you're doing, and you can become aware of, say, subtle attempts or not so subtle attempts to show off rather than be present for the music.
Mm.
This is something that happens with a lot of musicians, beginners, but certainly even well-established, famous musicians would arguably be, in the business of showing off a little more than, so it becomes more sort of an egoic process, right? And you can become aware of that. And there are what I would consider the master musicians who get out of their own way and the music flows through them and are not trying to show off or uh, resorting to repetitive patterns because they sort of fall asleep a little bit as they're playing. So there are so many aspects of the playing and how we show up in our playing that can be directly related to who we are because you play who you are, right? And so then you can learn from how you show up as a player and what you find yourself doing. And sometimes you find that you're doing things that you weren't even necessarily aware of, and there's a lot you can learn from that. Right? So music certainly, yeah. I mean, I'm sure you have other practices, Nick, maybe that you can.
Yeah, I mean, uh, meditation, just
Yeah, yeah.
Zen meditation is good because it is a practice of developing mindfulness, and so you want to bring as much mindfulness to your somatic practice as possible. So somatic work like aikido or tai chi or yoga, all of these things are mindfulness practices, but just to sit and meditate can also be helpful sometimes. I go through periods where I meditate regularly because I want to get deeper into the mindfulness, and periods where the movement practices are themselves sufficient work on mindfulness. I don't feel like I need sitting meditation as well. So varies depending on different people. But also, just like Alfonso was talking about with the music, um, any uh anything, any sort of human interaction, right? You
Yeah.
can turn anything into an opportunity to practice. I mean, you know, uh anything from sex to being in a classroom, can you can, and this is a practice I highly recommend, walk into any situation, walk into any situation where you're interacting with other people with the intention of showing up as your most open, receptive, responsive self and see what happens.
Yeah. Or pay attention to, and I should say, really, pay
Mhm.
attention to the people who piss you off.
Yeah. Yeah. What is it about them? Right. That's a hint as to where one's own shadow is, right?
Right?
What really what really pisses me off here? Oh, it's
Oh,
that says
whoops.
something about,
It's
maybe what my shadow
little old
is.
me. Yeah. Uh,
Hmm. Um, I think we have
we
time
should
maybe for just one more question. Or
8:32.
yes, yeah, I think
Yes.
this will be the final question. Can transformative change be affected through somatics on a systemic level, for example, in an organization or even culture? That's a beautiful question. Um, I would say um, systems systems are made up of individuals, and so there's a balance. Systemic change is needed, right? You can have a bunch of individuals who are functioning very well, very healthy, psychologically, and have the best intentions and all that. But in a terrible system, what they can do is limited. The system is terrible. So systemic change is needed. But at the same time, you can have a great system worked out, but if the people in it are constantly reactive and can't do conflict, it's all going to fall apart eventually. So you need both the individual and systemic change. Somatics are mostly happen on an individual level because they're happening from the inside out in a person, but you can create systems that lend themselves well to it. So an example of uh, you know, um, fascistic cultural movements, right? Fascism and fascist adjacent movements are very big on keeping people from being healthy on a somatic level. There's
Mm,
a lot of restriction on how people can conduct themselves, right? A lot of that, like boys don't cry, men should never be tender stuff. A lot of you know, a lot of physical rigidity being cultivated, encouraging women to not feel into their power, encouraging men to mistake rigidity and dominance for power.
yeah.
Their fascist cultures are not very big on, yeah, relax and breathe. Similarly, exploitive cultures, right? Amazon workers are very strictly policed in terms of like limited bathroom breaks and that sort of thing. So they can't follow their own bodily needs and their own bodily
Right.
feelings. They have to behave like the system forces them into these robotic roles where they're resources instead of people. So creating an organizational culture where people are encouraged to take breaks and talk to each other and breathe and relax, that essentially you are creating a system that lends itself to people doing somatic work, just even doing the practice of taking a moment to physically relax. If you
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
you start if you have a 400 person, 500 person corporation and you start business meetings with 3 minutes of meditation and breathing, and anytime things get tense, the person facilitating the meeting calls a halt and has everyone just breathe and rest and take a moment to move and stretch. You're creating a system in which individual somatic work more readily takes
Mm.
place. So there's an interface between the individual and systemic in that way.
And I think 8:36 in California.
Yeah, I think we're out of time there. I want to thank everybody for showing up and for all these really great questions.
Yeah,
And
Nick, it's always such a pleasure to see you and to
oh,
speak with you.
likewise, really enjoyed being able to have this conversation with you and do it in this intriguing, novel, public sort of way. So
Right.
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And thank you to Public Programs for putting all this
Yeah.
together.
Thanks, guys.